Peter, great having you on here. It's a pleasure to have you on the show. And Peter is a part of Carta, a company that is building the infrastructure for private investing and venture capital investing. So the customer in this case are startups, big and small, as well as the funding and the partners that invest in these companies. For a normal listener, it might not be something that really they come across, just because when we say, hey, you know what, there's an investment in this company, there's a misconception that it is easy, in the sense that people just think, oh, you know what, I can just wire someone some money, right? I can just send them a Venmo and for a certain amount of money, and maybe I get a stake in that company. It
Right.
does sound easy, but it is actually quite daunting, just
Yeah.
because we're talking about financial stuff, we're talking about regulatory implications, inaccuracies in that ownership, and the cap table can have huge implications downstream, few years down the line. So that's
Yep.
where Carter steps in. And it's great having Peter, who runs insights at Carta, to give us this overview of how his team's using data-driven strategies and innovative solutions to simplify this complexity that we're talking about. And ultimately, the goal is to be transparent, because the cap table can be quite complex. So
Mhm.
that's what we are here to talk about. And yeah, Peter, again, great to have you on the show.
Absolutely. Great to be here. Thanks for the invite.
Yeah, totally. So I guess jumping right in, Peter, I mentioned about how on things have changed. We get a lot of
Mhm.
startups have enough on their plate already. They have their product, they have their competition, they have all this crazy stuff going on. And managing equity still seems the hardest part, and actually the most consequential. Because
Mhm.
if they get something wrong there, it's lifelong, right?
Yeah.
It's lifelong for the lifetime of the company, is what I'm
Right.
saying. I'd like to jump straight into maybe some common challenges faced by companies that you see when it comes to managing equity and errors and potential legal and financial complications.
Absolutely. There's a whole host of things we could get into there. I think taking a step back and just talking about the problem that Carta was created to solve was, back in the day, you would manage your cap table, and the cap table would be simply a spreadsheet, or in some cases even a Word doc, where it just outlined, hey, this person owned this percentage of my company, which seems easy, but you can imagine all of the headaches and complications that came from different investor preferences when someone invests in your company, different spreadsheets that are not updated and they don't show the same number when it comes to the percentage of shares. And then you're in a legal fight about who owns what in this company. So at the original mission, Henry and our founding team came up with the idea of digitizing cap tables. That's back when we were known as e-shares. And the idea was that you would keep your cap table in software rather than on either handwritten or in spreadsheets. And you would be able to easily update that cap table. You would be able to issue shares to employees, investors, advisors, everyone much more easily. And you would save time because Carta would host and like reconcile all of those different transactions for you so that your cap table was already up to date. And then when you go into a fundraising conversation with an investor, they can look at your cap table and clearly understand who owns what portion of the company, which is a really big deal to investors, because as they give you money as the founder, they're expecting a certain percentage or allocation in your company back. So it is incumbent upon them to understand who already owns portions of this company. How does it work with my new investment? So all of that was tons of headaches. As you mentioned, it still can be a lot of headaches for entrepreneurs, and they don't typically get into startups for in order to manage a cap table. That's not the idea. They want to build a unicorn or change the world. So that's our little piece of their world that we can help them eliminate headaches and put this into the background so they can focus on building the thing that they want to build.
Man, this is the kind of stuff, again, that isn't so visible to the normal consumer. Just to clarify, what are businesses doing today to address this issue? Is I've seen a lot of spreadsheets on this and a lot of like manual solutions towards fixing this issue. I guess my question's around, were you surprised seeing that companies were managing such an important and consequential thing, as Shikher was talking about earlier, through this super manual process? Like, that's got to be crazy.
I'm honestly still surprised by it. I think we're not the only cap table provider out there. It's getting to be a slightly more crowded space. But internally, we talk about the number one competitor we have is spreadsheets still in
Wow.
2023. So it's like not
Even now.
totally. And it's not a problem that is, and in some ways, when you think about it, I was surprised by it, but if you think about it really logically, it makes sense in that at the very earliest stages, if it's just two founders in a garage making up this new idea, they're probably going to come to some conclusion about who owns what percentage of the company between the two of them. They might write it down or they put it in their incorporation documents. And that's it for a while. A lot of times they don't hire for a while. They're trying to experiment with MVPs, and there's a whole host of early stage company building stuff. And then you get to the point of you are forced to think about cap tables for one of two reasons. Either you want to hire someone and you want to give them a portion of your company because that's become so standard in Silicon Valley and across tech startups, or you want to get an investment from someone. And that also requires that you give them equity, or at least the promise of equity using an instrument like a safe or something. So that's when people start thinking, oh, wow, I really got to get this modernized a little bit. And hopefully that's the point at which you come to Carta. Although if you get it started earlier, you have way fewer headaches and there's less lawyer time and you just save everybody a lot of annoyance and teeth gnashing.
Yeah, I've read a couple of articles saying that Carta is such a significant upgrade from lawyers and spreadsheets.
We love lawyers, but initial cap table stuff, that's not a good use of their time.
Right. Yeah. And a lot of money. Very expensive
Totally.
to get into. Yeah. One of the things that we wanted to talk to you about today was.
Sorry, that's my puppy.
All good.
She's decided that she also hates spreadsheets.
She's
very
That's great. That's great.
Whenever it comes up, she just can't take it.
So just to mention, Peter, we've been looking at your product before we get into a call with any founder. We look into the product, we check out the website, kind of figure out what the space is. We don't have a lot of exposure to this stuff.
Yep.
And I did your cap table one-on-ones on YouTube.
Oh, cool.
Very interesting stuff to learn in early stages. Also like to relate to folks who haven't necessarily had a finance background. So like the most basic stuff that you're explaining. I wanted to get into the Carta product and how it's developed since then, your evolution from shares and how now you have such a suite of products that are so useful now for early stage startups. Could you share what was the biggest unlock of a product that Carta was bringing to your customers?
Yes, I think the company was founded back in 2013 for that initial mission of digitize cap tables and move from Excel and spreadsheets into software. And then essentially, if you want to look at the company in a very simplistic way, we've just basically found other problems that look a lot like that initial problem, and we go and solve those for founders. So the next one was 409A. And if you're not in tech startups, you might not have ever heard that term 409A valuations before. But essentially what it is a mandate by the US government that says you need to have an independent third party, someone place a fair market value on the shares of your company if you're a private company, so that we have some idea of what they're worth before you start giving them out to employees and other people. So you typically get this once a year, unless you raise a round, and then it might be twice in that year. And it used to be a ridiculously long headache. This would be the kind of thing where a founder in a Series A company would come in, and this team would be going through reams of data, these lawyers, these accountants, and they would try to comp this Series A company to like public comps that might be Facebook or other things. It's a weird process. So a lot of what we did for the second product was to automate and turn those 409A evaluations from services into software. It's not completely done, but we've made a huge strides on that. So it's a lot easier to get a 409A through Carta now than it used to be. And then it's just layering other products on for founders. And along the way, we added an amazing business that helps VCs as well. But on the founder side, I think one of the most interesting ones that it's only about 2 years old now, is Carta Total Compensation. And that gives founders, so if you can imagine, as the equity holder, as the person who runs the cap table, we can see what each individual employee gets in terms of their equity grants, like what are their stock options when they join, which is a pretty unique view into compensation. So what we did was we said, okay, we have this equity piece. if companies come on and want to use this equity piece to help make better offers to new candidates, we'll go ahead and take the salary from their existing HR systems and match it up. So we can say, hey, for a level
Wow.
5 engineer in San Francisco, here's what the current market is for their salary and their equity. So helping founders understand how to hire better, what exactly their offer should look like, and then how that changes over time has been a great unlock for a lot of founders. Obviously, hiring is a little bit down right now, but even so, it's wonderful to get a sense of what is market because it's such an opaque sort of thing.
That's so interesting. It's Tin slash Indeed slash Glassdoor
Yep.
for early stage startups, but a bit more, the data is a bit more like from the source.
Yeah, exactly. Instead of self-reported, it's directly
Exactly.
from the cap tables and the HR systems. It's a little
Wow.
bit, it's not as comprehensive, obviously, as a Glassdoor, which takes jobs from all sorts of different places. Ours is very tech startup focused, but even I'd probably say the data is certainly more reliable.
That's awesome. And Peter, so I guess so the first problem to solve was, okay, managing this cap table. And now the expansion, just last year, Carta acquired Warbon, which is the competitor in UK. So it seems like Carta is trying to become the infrastructure player for startups in general, from their money to their hiring to other decisions, right? So with regards to that expansion, how was the insights that you were able to generate? I remember we follow you on LinkedIn a lot, and there's just so much data that's coming out that is, wow, we keep tabs with the startup ecosystem, but it seems
Yep.
like the data that you're publishing is really different from, say, a Bloomberg or, I don't know, Morning Brew or whatever startup media is out there, because it
Yeah.
seems like it's coming from the source. So how does that process work, and what began that kind of route?
Yeah. So my team at Carta is an insights team, and we work cross-functionally between the data and the marketing teams here. And it's a pretty unique position, honestly. So the way that I describe my role is we exist to make Carta data more useful to the ecosystem, to current clients, and then to future clients. So with that in mind, because again, we have access to this underlying cap table, when a new company goes out and they raise their Series A, they record all the information about that Series A on our cap. So they'll say, hey, we got this much investment for this valuation. We gave up this much of the company. Here were the different terms involved, all those kinds of things. So you can imagine if you looked individually, you could see what each company was doing. And obviously, we would never publish individual company data like that. But at an aggregate level, you can say, is the median Series A valuation going up or down? By how much? For what kinds of companies? Is there a big difference between a SaaS company in San Francisco and a renewable energy company in Seattle, for instance? So my team gets to break all that data out and then offer it up to the market in the form of reports and everything like that. And to be honest, the reason we do it is because we can. And it seems, like you said, there's a lot of different ways to get data about the private markets, but not all
Yeah.
of them are very transparent. And candidly, like some of them are quite wrong a lot of the time. So we were like, if we exist as a company to create more owners, which is the mission of Carta, the way that we want to do that is by incentivizing more people to start startups and then grant equity ownership to employees, advisors, financial investors, et cetera. It helps us for everyone in the ecosystem to be working off of the same set of facts. And if we can be the ones to provide those facts so that the conversation between an investor and a founder is easier, they can come to a conclusion much more quickly on what the valuation of a company should be, then we've done our job. And so that's the mission of my team. And I think it ladders up really nicely to the mission of the company. And I think I don't think there's very many teams that get to do exactly what we do, but I'd imagine that over the next 3 to 5 years within tech startups and specifically, the value of this like first party proprietary data is going to become more and more significant. And I would be shocked if more companies aren't doing a little bit of what we're doing here over the coming years.
It's so powerful. Just prior to this, the reason why I asked that, and thanks for answering that, is because some of the stuff that you are providing is like real time. You're talking about Q1 when Q2 just literally has started. So that level of insight is insightful for startups because usually there's such a lag between, oh, you know what, usually the market series A is around this valuation if you're this type
Yep.
of company. So by your team labeling that data and making it accessible just is such an unlock, not just for the VCs, but the startups as well. The
Yep.
founders, the employees, all of them. Yeah.
Obviously, we agree, and a lot of that credit should go to my data science team, who are absolutely wonderful keeping up all these models. A lot of, and I've been in startups my whole career, but I hadn't spent a lot of time thinking about it from the venture point of view. And the venture over the last 10 years has exploded as this more professional asset class. For a long time, venture, and it still sometimes is a relationship business. Who do you know? How do you get access to these important investors? How can you network in this fairly small city in Silicon Valley and San Francisco in particular? And in the last 10 years, it's gone over this radical shift of there's venture everywhere, all of these different ecosystems sprouting up, even if Silicon Valley is still home. And another way that we like to frame our data insights internally is how can we turn a first time founder into a second time founder in terms of their knowledge, in terms of their ability to negotiate, in terms of their being able to sit across the table from an investor and really command the room. And a lot of that comes from data access. It is an asymmetrical thing. It used to be that VCs had a lot of data from their prior investments and founders were walking in with basically nothing. But hopefully over time, we can make sure that those first time founders feel really confident when they're going out and raising for their startups. Because eventually, if more startup deals are done, people can come to quicker assignations of value, then more people get equity. These startups grow more quickly, a boon to all of us.
Yeah, thanks. It's like Shikher said, what a powerful thing. I just wanted to ask you, do you have a specific example of an insight that was such an unlock for a founder, or something that maybe an anecdote of someone who's used these insights to change the way they've done their startup? And beyond the basic services that you guys provide, this is a huge unlock.
Great question. Yeah, there's been a multiple stories come to mind here. I think one of the most recent ones is we put out a little mini report and a couple graphics on what startups are paying their first 5 hires in equity. So if you just take the founding team, take them out of it and say the first 5 people that this founding team hires who are the core of this new business, what do you give them in terms of percentage ownership in the company? And we put this little report out, and then I got some really wonderful notes back from a couple founders who were in the pre-seed stage, and they're saying, "Thank you so much for this benchmarks. It really helped guide the conversation when I was hiring my first engineer or I was hiring my first product person." And we were able to come to a much cleaner agreement as to what the percentage ownership of that person should be. So like giving a lot of times what happens is it's never going to be that you look at a chart from Carta and you say, okay, that's the number for me, because there's a whole host of why your startup is unique, why your relationships with investors are unique, all those kinds of things. But what it can do is it can guide the conversation. So you can say, okay, for this first hire, I'm going to pick between 1% and 2%. And then your discussion is between 1% and 2%. It's not between 0.25% and 10%. And you just can't come to a conclusion. So I think that those early hire stuff has been one of the most rewarding kinds of things that we've worked on, because it's just super cool to see founding teams hire their first 5 or 10 employees. It's such an exciting time in a business. I was employee number 13 at an old startup, and I remember it being like a really big deal, you know?
Yeah. No, now employees can't come in and demand some crazy amount of shares.
They
There's some
certainly
very
could.
useful-
It's a question of whether or not they'll get them. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. No, it's really interesting because this makes the product a lot more sticky as well. Beyond building your initial infrastructure on here, the type of value that you're building for the people who invest in this and who build their infrastructure on this, it's going to be long term. So really cool to see this. I guess if it's okay with you, Shikher, I'm going to move on to Peter's
Yeah, for sure.
foray into it. And talking about this data analytics piece and how you've incorporated it into the whole business model of Carta. I think I'm really interested because I think I had seen you on TV before. I think I've seen you on BBC, if I'm not mistaken. But I've seen, because during the pandemic, I'm a subscriber of BBC and I watch their stuff all the time. But I had seen a clip of you when I was looking you up. you were presenting some insights about COVID.
Yeah.
It was just really interesting for me because doing the research on you, like just your background on this stuff, is the value that you provided, at least for Carta in your insights role and that insights team that you've created,
Mhm.
comes from your interest in this space,
Yeah.
gathering this type of data and providing some sort of expertise. Just wanted to
Yeah.
ask you, what was your personal journey to getting into data viz and just helped unlock a lot of things in your company and your career? So just wanted to hear
Yeah.
that story.
Yeah. Thank you for putting it kindly as interest instead of dweebiness, spending a lot of time in
Yeah.
data viz. But so actually it started at my old startup, which was called Public Relay. It's actually back east and it does media analytics for Fortune 500 companies typically. And in that role, I was both got my hands dirty with a lot of Tableau analytics and leading teams on that. And then after getting a bit burned out with data viz originally, I ported over to the marketing side and ran product marketing teams. And so that's the background. That's the marriage of product marketing, data storytelling with data visualization skills. And then, as you mentioned, the pandemic happened. It's March of 2020, April 2020. We're all sitting around in our apartments, pretty worried and also with a lot of nervous energy. And I got on Twitter for the first time, which you can decide whether or not that's a good idea. And I just started putting out graphs from data sets that I found across the web. And some people found those graphs useful. And then we started conversations. And then actually the journalists who ran one of the biggest data sets, the COVID tracking project at the Atlantic, got in touch and said, hey, would you come and help us run this data viz team that we're standing up internally? So I went and did a moonlighting project for them for 10 or 11 months. And that's like a PhD in putting data out both quickly and like with a
Wow.
ton of feedback. As you can imagine, you're working with COVID data, like around testing, cases, hospitalizations, deaths, like very serious metrics, and you're putting it out on social platforms every day. Um, you're going to get a ton of feedback, and not all of that feedback is going to be positive. My DMs were pretty much a wreck for that year, and it was a it was on a, it's like going to grad school for both data storytelling and then also having to set up systems so you can come out with something new every day that's from the same set of data. So that was an incredible experience, probably the most rewarding thing I've done in my career so far. And actually, an engineer who was volunteering with that project worked at Carta. And so she introduced me to our CMO, and the rest is history there. But I do firmly feel that over the next 3 to 5 years, more and more companies and organizations will turn to their first party data and say, how can we build our brand? How can we like become the thought leader in the space with something unique to say? Because there's a ton of wonderful blogs and different pieces of content, but it's easier to get attention, I think, with that piece of proprietary data.
Nice. Yeah, it's so fascinating how a project here project in a different industry could result in you applying the principles to
Yeah.
startups, and then that also having such a profound effect on the ingesters of that data. So,
Yeah.
was there like big takeaways that like were you able to map it to the Carta insights? Is there something like it could be even a font size that you're like, no, this is the way, this is the best way to do it, and that's the mandate because I will learn it
Yeah.
pushing out the most sensitive data for 1 year.
That is a great question. I'm not sure I would default to font size. And I have a nice, here as opposed to at CTP, at least I have a wonderful design team who can give me some guidelines on how we want things to look a little bit. But no, I think the most important things that I learned from the time at CTP that I've ported over to Carta, I would say three things. So first and foremost, iteration matters way more than day-to-day content. Don't get hung up on whether or not this is exactly what we should be putting out or have a ton of different review sessions set up to say, this is one graphic, we feel comfortable with it. Just put stuff out. Just start putting things out and the market will tell you what's interesting and what's not interesting. So I feel like a lot of times companies will go into this kind of thing and they'll say, we need to build a 20-page PDF report with the best global consumer insights that we found. And they should actually probably just be putting out daily graphics on LinkedIn or Twitter because that feedback loop is incredibly important and it sharpens the way that you build graphics. immensely. The second thing, and this is a personal one, it's not a must have, but tooling matters a lot here. So I am a Tableau aficionado. I've tried basically every BI tool under the sun. And I think Tableau is the right mix of complexity in what you can build and then ease in the visual presentation of that build. So I'm a big advocate there. And I also use a bit of Figma, the design tool, basically every day to up level the graphics and add some interactivity occasionally and that kind of thing. And then the last part is and this is something that I've been really grateful that Carta has allowed me to do. And I think that other companies should adopt it. I don't think that a lot of, at least within tech, buying processes, it's less about case studies and what you can download from people's websites and much more about, do you trust the people at that company? So like building internal brands, having your subject matter experts or employees at the company be spokespeople for your brand, and doing it with data is often a great way to start. But like just allowing people to speak naturally on these platforms, it just garners way more attention than what you can do on the brand side or what if only your CEO is allowed to talk and things like that, which unfortunately hearing from startups is still sometimes the case. So those would be 3 points that I would say would be those were learnings that I took from the tracking project that have been very helpful.
That's awesome. Yeah, it's when we look at the data that he put out, it's so interesting. It provides us with trends of how the landscape of equity management looks, be it you also go into the niches in one industry versus another. Like you mentioned, it could be SaaS versus a sustainability industry, or it could be within the cap table itself, within the funding round. So Series A versus Series B and stuff. So I'd like to just step back a bit, go a bit macro on you, Peter, if that helps, and understand, like, considering over the last 10 years, this industry has exponentially grown. What are some specific areas that you as a team are actively looking, 1 year, 2 years down the line? Because I bet there's a lot of ever-changing regulatory landscape. So how do you expect your service to change based on these trends that are coming up?
It's a complex problem space, I would say, within cap tables in general, and then basically just infrastructure for founders. So I think the biggest mindset shift that we've had is, for a while, we were a cap table company and that's what we did. But when we look around at our product suite now, are we a cap table company? Like, yes, certainly that's like a core part of our business, but we're so much more than that. Like we have so many other things to offer, and that's good and bad. That's good because you can help a lot of different personas, but it's bad because it makes the message a lot more cluttered. Like how can you stand out in all of these spaces? And we have competitors in all of these spaces that do only one thing. And so being a platform company around private markets it's a much more difficult challenge. So the two things I'll highlight in terms of bets that we are making internally that we think are great places to look. So one is on specifically around venture capital. VC as an asset class has grown tremendously over the last 10 years. I think it will only continue. It's having a little bit of trouble now, but my firm belief is it'll only continue to grow over the next 10. And that's for a lot of reasons. But one of the biggest easy ones to understand is companies are going public much later in their life cycle. So if a company has already been in existence for 12, 13, 14 years, by the time it goes public, a lot of investors want to get access to the alpha that company creates before it hits the public market. So people are going down market in that way. So back office for venture funds is like a big bet for Carta that we're already deeply into. And then the other one, which is pretty exciting, we candidly haven't cracked the code here yet, is around liquidity. So liquidity in private markets just means trading of stock options or shares. So as you can imagine, if you want to buy a stock of Apple, one Apple stock, you go on to Charles Schwab right now and you buy it. No problem. You get it from Robinhood. There's 1,000 ways to do it. That's not true for private companies. It's much murkier. It's much harder to transact. There's much less price discoverability on how much should a potential investor pay for one share of Carta, for instance, which is still private. So a lot of team and time within Carta is being spent on how do we unlock liquidity in the right ways for both private market investors and then eventually private market employees as well, so that they can realize some value from their shares. They don't have to wait 12 years for that IPO. So those are the two probably next like big private market bets that Carta has made and will continue to double down on.
That's really cool because on both points, I literally jotted it down because I was like, wow, this is such really great insights. Because on the first point, you mentioned how, okay, you are traditionally a cap table company, but now you're much more than that. Now, your insights can get tapped into public investors who are waiting for for a company or are mulling over a decision to take a company public. So the first thing that came to my mind is Carta, probably Adobe buying Figma would probably need Carta's insights to understand, hey, how does this look? Now that's a public company that also needs your services in addition to a big startup. So that was a really interesting point on the first thing. And on the second, is I bet throughout Uber's surge, there must have been some investors who wanted to sell at Series G because it's okay. We've had it enough. How many series rounds are we going to have? Are we going to do like XYZ? They had so many fundraising rounds that I bet people were like, okay, you know what? I'm good. I invested in Series A, and now it's a Series H. Like maybe I can take off 10%, 20% off the table just because that seems like proper risk management.
Yeah, so that's exactly what the thinking is there, that secondary markets, which exist, it's not as though Carta is inventing secondary markets. They're really tough to deal with right now, is that there's going to be more desire to take bets off the table or say, hey, oftentimes what we're hearing is that seed stage investor is, I invest in seed stage companies. I don't really have any interest nor expertise in how to think about betting on a Series F company that's going to go public in 2 years. My thing is the earliest stages. So I'd love to take the winners off the table a little bit earlier and use that capital to recycle it back into early stage startup. Hopefully that mission continues to be realized. We have some products around liquidity now, and those are pretty fantastic for individual companies and like company sponsored transactions. But there's a whole host of cool, interesting things to be done on the liquidity side.
Yeah. And go for it, Jed. Sorry.
No, it's just going to ask, have you or anyone in the company played around with the idea of Carta also diving into private platform for investors where they could actually come in and see companies at which series they're in and decide whether or not they want to be part of the pie? Is that something you guys have played with?
We haven't. It's certainly not the first time it's come up. We haven't built anything like that yet. And some of it is just where do we fall back on as a company and say, who do we serve? Primarily, we serve startup founders. And there are many people who have asked us in the past, can you build a marketplace? Can you build a marketplace so that I, as a founder, can be matched with VCs and just find investment more easily? Candidly, again, we really haven't cracked that one very well. And there's been a couple little attempts, but really it's not been something that we've focused on. And some of that is we want to do right by all founders. We don't want to favor anyone. And some of that is it's a difficult marketplace to start. But we do have both nodes of the network. Watch this space. I don't think it's one of the problems we're solving this year, but it's definitely an interesting idea.
Yeah, it's particularly super interesting to me because not only do you have two parts of the node, you also have all of the data that would be relevant for these types of transactions. And the most fundamental thing is providing good data as well. When you go through these transactions and they trust you as a good place to keep their cap tables. And it's just an interesting thing to think about because you have literally all the tools for this marketplace. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but it's something that just came up as an idea as we were looking at this.
I think the other part, and you just reminded me of this, and I should have brought it up earlier, but one of the things that we have thought about going into and we're starting to make some bets on is, okay, Carta, the original thesis of Carta is digitize these cap tables. Who does that mostly help? It helps founders because what were they doing before? They were either doing it themselves or have paying lawyers to do it. And lawyers are incredibly expensive sometimes. So that is establishing a system of record. So Carta is the one source of truth on who owns what percentage of your company.
Yeah.
You can imagine though, and we're starting to see this, is that it would be a great jump to go from a system of record to a system of transaction, where the actual fundraising and money changing hands happens through Carta pipes, because we can reconcile it so much more quickly. We already have access to all the underlying data. It's just like a more seamless, streamlined process. So we're actually trying this thing called Carta Deal Concierge, where startups can come to us and they can say, hey, I am raising a seed round. Here is my term sheet from the investor. And what we'll do is we'll say, instead of paying lawyers all their billable hours, you use the lawyer for what they're great for, which is the negotiation part. And we'll handle all the admin work, like sending out signature docs and looking at the term sheet and analyzing the terms and stuff like that. So we're actually like part of the fundraising process instead of just being a system of record for who owns what. That's literally like a month old, maybe 2 weeks old. It's exciting times, but that would be a really cool way to make, again, the whole goal is to make it easier for founders to create great companies. Helping them fundraise is certainly part of that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One
And
of the things.
yeah.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No. And I was just going to say, a lot of this just is like a black box. No one knows what's happening inside.
Yeah.
The people who are inside don't know what's happening outside of their workflow. Like, it's just such, and I would say it's personal data. The company does not really want to, unless they go public, they don't really want to share certain amount of details with regards to stock comp and stuff like that. So yeah, I totally get it.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, it's very private data that we are lucky enough to be trusted to handle and to hold in confidence. But you're right. It's the space itself is super opaque and it's just tough to know what's going on. Heck, we're sometimes like, what's going on? We might just
So, just on that point, as we kind of wrap, and you're quite busy, were there some, because you're handling this data that not many people are privy to, and companies and VCs actually would love the data, right?
Yep.
Were there some insight that just that just got you go, I would have never thought about this. The reason I asked this is because I follow you, and you mentioned you have many of these posts and these trends. A recent one was how in 2023, the startup valuations are dropping. Another one was employees are foregoing their options a lot faster.
Yeah.
But the one that really stick to my mind is how you broke down at what stage is a company more likely to be acquired. I was like, that is so interesting. That's a great way to think about it. And yeah, was there anything that just made you go have an aha moment?
I mean, I love the acquisition one. I think startup acquisitions are so funny because it's like the thing that everyone wants, but doesn't actually talk about that much. Like when you're an early stage founder, you're like, I'm going for IPO. This is a rocket ship. Here we go. Not a lot of people are like, I'm planning on being in this company for 3 years until it gets bought. But that is that's a very typical route. And that's can be a fantastic exit for the founders and the employees. There's no shame in that at all. I think the one that I've been part of the things that I get to look at, which are sadly not as exciting these days, is, and you mentioned this a little bit, is just like, how is everything that's happening to startups impacting startup employees in particular? Not founders, not investors, but the day-to-day employees that are building these businesses. And the chart that you mentioned, so part of the promise of building a startup as an early employee is that you're going to get equity. You're going to get ownership in that startup. And that's what you are. That's part of why you join. You want to be aligned to the business incentives. And a lot of employees today are choosing not to exercise their right to buy those shares. So they're just letting them expire when they leave the company or when they're forced to leave the company through a layoff. And that's a shame. I think that is, sometimes it's done. A lot of times it happens for great financial reasons. You don't want to give up some cash right now for the promise of something later. You don't believe in that prospects of that startup anymore. And if you were just laid off, I don't blame you. That's a tough moment. But it is contra to the general view that part of what you're doing is you're working for this equity. Carta, obviously, is a platform that manages equity, but where these trends and a lot of what we do is around educating employees to make the right financial choice for them around their equity. But I do think that there are things that the ecosystem, startups as a whole, can do a little bit better to make sure that employees are educated, one, and then you're aligning the incentives. If an employee works for you for 2 or 3 years, they should probably have, this is my own hobby horse, but they should probably have longer than 90 days when they leave to make a choice about whether or not they get that equity.
Yeah.
Which is the
brutal.
standard now. That's a bit of I can rant about that for a while, but it trickles down. When you see all the turmoil in the public markets, that's going to go to private markets, and then that's going to go to private market employees over time.
Yeah, it seemed like that lag took quite some time, right? No, we saw that the big crash in 2022 where there's all the public markets and also the public companies that have private competitors, right? If you see markdowns in the public companies, why are the private companies still at those lofty valuations? And I was reading an article where the mismatch was the highest it's ever been last year. And now it's slowly aligning where, it makes sense that a private competitor for a public company should be at similar valuations. Seems like just because of lack of liquidity, it's frozen in the private state.
Yeah, you said it really well. It feels like it moves like molasses. It's like stuff happens every day in the public markets, and it's instantly you can see all these stock prices changing every second. Whereas in the private markets, you get revalued once every 2 years sometimes. And so a lot of stuff happens in between those time periods. It's in some ways, it's why companies stay private longer, because there's more opportunity to recover from a mistake, for instance, or pivot in a business model where, a pivot in a business model in a public company is, I just asked Zillow, it's almost impossible to do. So that's a great reason to keep private, but it does make it feels as though these private markets haven't responded more quickly or quickly enough to what's going on in the public comps that they have. And it's like an accordion, like it comes from the publics and then it hits late stage privates, and then it hits mid, and then it hits early, and then it hits startup employees. So it's definitely moved like a wave, and I hope we're at the sort of bottom part of the wave for valuations, and we'll see what happens over the next 6 months. But it's certainly not been the most fun 12 months in startups lately.
Yeah. And we might be close because just yesterday, I think day before, Kava, the Mediterranean restaurant, went public and was up 100% on the first day. So everyone, IPOs are back, baby.
Pretty necessary.
Hey,
we'll take it.
If it has an app, it's a tech company according to the markets.
100%. You're totally right. We'll claim that one for ourselves for sure. That's a big win.
So hopefully this is a positive sign for things to come in the coming days. And it was great having you on, Peter. Jen, anything else on your end?
No, was going towards the closing notes. Want to make sure we're on time.
Yeah. So, Peter, great having you on. Again, we discovered your great insights online. We just want to give you the stage and share with our listeners how they can reach out to you and access some of the great insights that you put out, and your team. So, please, we're giving you the stage to give a shout out.
Oh, wonderful. Yes, I put out probably 4 or 5 graphics a week around startups through my LinkedIn. So that's Peter James Walker. And if you just search that on LinkedIn with Carta, I'm sure I'll come up. And then we also write a weekly newsletter called the Data Minute, where we put out one more in-depth piece around what's happening in startup data every Thursday morning. So if you go to carta.com/subscribe, you will be able to find the Data Minute there. And those are the 2 main places. We've got a lot of interesting, fun content coming up soon. And hopefully, if everything goes right, we'll have a place where everyone can look through all of the visuals themselves on our website by the end of the year. That's the big project. So I say it publicly, so I will hold myself accountable in terms for it.
That's
you
great.
heard it here first.
We can always go retroactively and cut that bit. So it's all good. Yeah.
No, I need the public shame if it doesn't happen, because it's been a personal pet
You can
project for a long time. Yeah, exactly.
We'll put it on LinkedIn if it doesn't happen. So.
Put me on blast, guys. That's more than fair.
No, it's really cool to have you on, Peter. But yeah, great stuff. Learned so much from the call today.
Sounds great. This is super fun.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
All right, man.
Great.